It is July 24th, 2024, and Israeli Prime Minister and US backed war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu is in Washington, D.C., where he is giving a joint address to Congress. Now, I'm sure that there are going to be plenty of standing ovations. They are going to be gushing all over this man and not talking about the fact that he's wanted by the International Criminal Court, right? Not talking about the fact that that was the entire point of this address, as we saw Mike Johnson gave that invitation just a couple of days after the top prosecutor for the ICC announced that he was submitting an application for an arrest warrant against Netanyahu. But as all of that happens, you have Israel carrying out one massacre after another in the Gaza Strip against the Palestinians there. All of this is a reminder that every single member of Congress that is standing there and applauding Netanyahu today, they all have blood on their hands. And as we know, as we've seen in the past, this is not Netanyahu's first rodeo and not his first trip to Washington, D.C. In the past, going back to 2002, he sold the lie of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. He sold Washington on the need to invade Iraq. Well, he also sold them the need to back out of the Iran nuclear deal. That's something that he helped accomplish with the Trump administration. And now the question becomes, what is Netanyahu going to be selling this time around? And if it's a direct war with Iran, which, as we've seen coming from Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he's starting up those warnings again, saying, oh, Iran is 2 weeks away from being able to acquire a nuclear weapon. Well, if that's the case, then how likely is Washington going to be to sign on to a full-on war with Iran while they already clearly had their hands full? We discussed all that and more with the special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Dimitri Lascaris, a Canadian journalist, activist, and lawyer who was recently back from the West Bank and southern Lebanon. Dimitri, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
It's a pleasure speaking with you, Rachel.
Now, I want to get your take on the latest here. I know that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in Washington, D.C. this week, and he's addressing a joint session of Congress. I thought it was interesting because the timing of his invite came just days after the top prosecutor for the International Criminal Court confirmed he was seeking a warrant for Netanyahu's arrest on war crimes charges. So, what does his visit tell us about how U.S. lawmakers view international law?
Well, I think they established a long time ago that they are oozing contempt for international law. They've constantly put forward this alternative model, which they never tell us, explain to us, which is called the rules-based order. Here in Canada, that phrase comes out of Justin Trudeau's mouth every other time he speaks to an international leader. And basically what that means, and this is what they believe in, is they get to make the rules and that the rules don't apply to them. Basically, that's it. So they determine the content of the obligations imposed upon states, and whatever the obligations may be, they are free to violate them with impunity, which they've been doing for decades. And I think what's particularly astonishing about this visit, as you mentioned, Netanyahu is now the subject of an arrest warrant application for, amongst other crimes against humanity, extermination, which sounds a lot like genocide. And there are other allegations fully justified being leveled against him. And we know what's going to happen. He's going to walk into Congress. And as I explained it on Twitter, hundreds of deranged psychopaths are going to give multiple standing ovations to a deranged psychopath. That's what we're about to witness. The whole world is watching this in a state of disbelief. And these people in Congress have completely lost touch with reality, because whatever their views about international law may be, if they want to sustain American power, they have to at least take into account how they're being perceived by the world. I think they're completely oblivious to the fact that this is astonishing to 75 to 80% of humanity, that they're going to give standing ovations to this man who's carrying out a genocide and was just named in an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court prosecutor.
Yeah, it's crazy to me. And I know that, up until this point, being pro Israel is just kind of something that is accepted in the US government. It's almost expected, right? You have APAC lobbying to make sure that members of Congress don't question that support. But it's not often that they find themselves in a position like they are today, where the average person, the average member of the public, I would argue, should be looking at them and going, wait a second, you've got Israel carrying out a full on genocide using weapons made in the USA, completely enabled by the US. And yet you're sitting here inviting this war criminal to come speak to all of us. And oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure we could all take bets on the number of standing ovations that are going to happen for Netanyahu. And it's sad that we're at that point. It's also interesting to me, though, that he's not just going to speak to Congress, he's also planning to speak to Biden, to Harris, and he's also planning to meet with former President Trump. How do you view those meetings? The fact that, well, on one hand, these three people are willing to sit down with Netanyahu, but on the other hand, even with all of these reports about the, tensions that Biden or that Trump have with Netanyahu, they still are overwhelmingly pro-Israel, and there doesn't seem to be anything that is changing that.
Look, we have really no practical, persuasive reason to believe that the policies of the US government towards this genocidal monster will change either under Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. However, Trump is a bit of a wild card. I thought it was interesting that J.D. Vance was not going to go to the speech, his vice presidential nominee. I'm not at all surprised that neither Biden nor Trump would be there. That would be kind of beneath their dignity to sit in the audience and give standing ovations to another leader, even if it is Israel's leader, especially when they themselves didn't issue the invitation. But you would have thought that Trump might send Vance as a sign of respect, and he's not doing that. And I think another thing I noticed about his endless, interminable speech at the Republican National Convention, and also in his debate with the demented Joe Biden, is he actually didn't spend a lot of time talking about Israel. He seemed a lot more interested in talking about drill, baby, drill, in talking about the crisis on the border, this massive influx of illegal aliens, which he constantly talks about. He seemed more interested in talking about, the Ukraine war, frankly. And there he's taking a line which is radically different from that of the United States political elite. He's saying he's going to bring it to an end. Whether he does that or not is another matter. So at this stage, I wouldn't go so far as to say I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm not optimistic at all. I don't think any of us should be optimistic, those of us who care about peace, justice, and the Palestinian people. But I wouldn't rule out the possibility that he will try to impose some level of restraint on Netanyahu, if for no other reason than he wants to rebuild the esteem of the United States in this incredibly oil-rich region. Particularly, he wants to help out the Saudis, who are under a lot of pressure. There was a poll that was done a few months ago which showed that 96% of the people in Saudi Arabia wanted to sever diplomatic relations with Israel.
Wow.
So there's pressure there. There's grassroots pressure, and I think he'll want to reestablish good relations with the U.S. puppets in the region. And in order for him to do that, I think he probably will have to impose some level of restraint on Netanyahu or whoever succeeds him. Whether he'll do that or not, as I said, I'm not optimistic, but I wouldn't rule it out.
Yeah, the interesting thing about Trump's rhetoric on this, too, I know that in some of his statements, he's kind of said, okay, Israel needs to wrap it up. And that to me says he doesn't want to deal with this if he gets back into office, right? He's going, I don't want to be the next Genocide Joe where there's all these people protesting US involvement and now it's my fault. He's wanting Netanyahu to kind of get on with it. But as we've seen from every attempt at ceasefire talks with Hamas, you have Hamas giving some concessions on their end, and then Netanyahu comes in with more demands, right? Basically making it so that it is not possible to come together on a deal. And yet just the timing of his trip, I know that this is something that was requested by Mike Johnson, but when you look at the timing of it and you see that Israel is carrying out massacre after massacre in the Gaza Strip against the Palestinian people, but it doesn't really seem like they're achieving anything militarily. You know, they'll say we eradicated Hamas from this area, and then a couple months later, they're back, invading that area all over again because Hamas is back there. So what do you make of the timing and kind of where Israel stands right now as Netanyahu is in DC?
Israel's head is in the jaws of defeat. I don't think there's any other possible interpretation of those from those who are paying attention to the facts on the ground. So let me cite a few for you. Hezbollah today published its third surveillance video. And this one was of the Ramat David Air Force Base in north of Israel, which houses F-16 squadrons and a classified unit that operates UAVs, deadly drones. It took intensive, detailed video footage of the entire base and did it both at daytime and nighttime, meaning that it had at least 2 overflights, or it hovered above the base for hours without detection. Yemen just attacked Tel Aviv, and the Israelis said that they discovered, much to their chagrin, that this drone had 500 kilometers more range on it than the previous longest range drones that the Houthis had used. Or I shouldn't call them Houthis, they're Ansar Allah. And then, of course, you have the fact that Eilat, the port in Eilat, is going out of business because I was actually there several months ago. It was like a ghost town. The Ansar Allah movement has killed the Red Sea traffic to the only Red Sea port that Israel has. You have the Israeli military complaining that they don't have in court documents, that they're running out of parts they need to keep their tanks in the field. They simply can't repair them anymore because there's so much damage done and they have a limited supply of parts. Iran penetrated the air defenses of Israel in April, striking its most important and best protected air base with ballistic missiles repeatedly. And you have massive casualties. The Israelis have revealed that they have up to almost 10,000 wounded, several thousand people who are permanently disabled, and about a third of the wounded are suffering from mental disorder. And these are what they're telling us about. Who knows what the numbers actually are? So Netanyahu is staring defeat in the face, and I think he understands perfectly well. If you try to understand the logic of a psychopath, I think his logic is I need to stay in power as long as possible to finish the genocidal job. And the only way I can do that ultimately is to destroy the enemies, not just of Israel within historic Palestine, but in the region. And he can't do that without the United States. And this is where Tony Blinken comes in. Tony Blinken last week starts running around, shooting his mouth off, telling Americans that Iran is 1 or 2 weeks away from having a nuclear weapon. We've been hearing this for a couple of decades, of course. Now, whether or not it's true, the question is, why is he doing this a few days before Netanyahu shows up in Washington? Because I think what we're going to hear today from Netanyahu is a polite request, shall we say, that the United States sacrifice everything and go to full-blown war against Iran and Hezbollah. I think that that is ultimately the objective here, because Netanyahu realizes that unless the United States brings to bear all of its weapons against the full resistance in the Middle East, Israel is doomed. The genocidal project is doomed, not the Jewish people, but the genocidal project, the apartheid state, will ultimately be brought to despair.
How I'm sitting there wondering, is Netanyahu going to bring a chart, right? He's got to have the infamous chart for talking about Iran and being prepared to have access to a nuclear bomb. And yeah, that was interesting to me how Blinken, he made those statements. And of course, he is completely in the pocket of Israel, right? He has made it very clear that he is a proud Zionist and that he's proud to support them. And I just wonder, okay, so let's say hypothetically, Netanyahu comes to DC, he says, we need to go to war against Iran. And let's say that, whether it be Trump, Harris, whoever is in the Oval Office in January, they say, okay, that sounds good, let's do that. Well, this is not the only conflict war that the U.S. is pursuing. You've also got the U.S. over in Ukraine fighting this proxy war against Russia, struggling. They're not able to keep up with the industrial capacity. They're certainly not able to keep up with the manpower unless NATO gets fully involved. And then you also have the U.S. picking a proxy war against China over Taiwan. And I'm just sitting there going, okay, how do they think, if they decide that they are going to go, even if it's just war against Hezbollah, obviously that's Iran adjacent, but if it is a full-on war against Iran, it doesn't seem like something that the U.S. is able to keep up with. Of course, that never stopped them before, but how do you view the U.S. in this situation of all of the different conflicts that it's waging and trying to keep all of its partners and Israel specifically happy?
Well, the adults have left the White House, the adults have left the State Department, and there may not be any more adults left in the Pentagon. I mean, these people have the intellectual capacity of children, not just the demented ones. I mean, because even if your only objective, Rachel, is to maximize American power, you would not behave in this way. You would not try to take on Russia, China, Iran, the entire axis of resistance at the same time, especially when you're getting your ass handed to you, excuse my French, in Ukraine, which is exactly what's happening. This is ludicrous. You are hurtling towards a strategic defeat as an inevitable consequence, you, the American elite, as an inevitable consequences of your own decisions. The United States could be in a much more powerful position, a much more influential position. It could wield that power, not necessarily for the benefit of humanity, but in a way that would help the US to maintain a relatively dominant position in the world if it picked its battles, and if it handled itself in a way that it was at least plausibly compliant with international law. But these people have thrown all caution to the winds, and they are clinging to the delusion that they can defeat everybody at the same time. They are not living in reality, these people. And I think ultimately the US is going to be a victim of its own stupidity. Not the people of the US, but the elite of the United States will cause the demise of this empire.
Yeah, it's like they haven't paid attention to history and to, oh, this is what happens. This is why empires in the past no longer are these great, powerful empires, because they pick too many fights at once. And as we're seeing right now, I mean, we have this growing multipolar world where you have countries like Russia and China and Iran that all have tensions with the US, all saying, hey, I think we should work together instead of becoming adversaries with each other. Now, when it comes to what is currently going on the ground right now, I know that there has been a big focus on the Gaza Strip, and rightfully so. I mean, the Palestinian people that are there are going through horrors that are, it's unimaginable for us, especially as we look at this. It's like we cannot even comprehend what they are going through right now. And I know that you visited the West Bank recently, and so I also want to hear kind of about the situation there, if you would, because that's something that isn't really getting a lot of talk and focus, but at the same time, Israel is using all of this to target the Palestinian people everywhere, not just in Gaza.
Well, based on what I saw, Rachel, I had two overarching observations. The one is that the genocide is not confined to Gaza. The genocidal project extends across historic Palestine, but the Israelis are at least sensible enough to know that they cannot simultaneously wipe out the Palestinian people of the West Bank, especially because they're living amongst hundreds of thousands of Israelis and the people of Gaza at the same time. So they're doing a test run in Gaza. They're going to try to complete that sinister, diabolical mission, see if they can get away with it. And if they can, they will intensify in the West Bank and carry out a similar program of extermination. I have no doubt that that's the plan. I think the people in the West Bank, particularly in the refugee camps, understand this very well. And so they have embarked on what can fairly be described as a third intifada. They have taken up arms in a big way. And I spent most of my time in Jenin, which is the largest refugee camp. It's known as the Martyrs' Capital. I was also in Tulkarm, another large refugee camp in the West Bank. The Israelis came in every night and tore up civilian infrastructure, including the roads, and the Palestinians would come out in the morning and do the best to clean things up. They are raiding homes regularly. I stood beside a daycare center that had been completely demolished by an airstrike. I went inside and we could see that this was a daycare center. It was obvious. And they flattened, most of the building. I went to the home of a family that had just had their house raided several hours earlier. The mother and father were in the kitchen, and they explained to me, when we walked up to the building, the door had been blown off. There was glass everywhere. And they explained to me, they were distraught, that the Israelis had come into their house several hours earlier. Their three sons were in a bedroom. They beat them savagely while they held the mother at a door as a human shield, because they were concerned that the militants from the camp would come and confront them. And then when they'd finished beating up her sons, they took one of them away to an unknown location. And they're basically using him as a hostage because they were looking for a son who wasn't present at the time for reasons that they didn't specify. I went to the Jenin hospital after the Israelis shot in the back two men who were running into the emergency ward. They were trying to flee a hail of bullets that had descended on the courtyard outside the emergency ward. We interviewed the director of the hospital, And he showed me on his iPhone the video footage from the camera at the entrance to the emergency ward. And it showed very clearly that as a young man entered, he was running in, he was struck with a bullet just as he entered the door. He collapsed in a pool of blood, and an incredibly courageous medic tried to pick him up. His body was lifeless and limp, but you could see when he took him away with blood pouring out of him that there was no weapon. There was absolutely no weapon. The man was unarmed, shot in the back in cold blood. And I saw similar things when I was in South Lebanon, again, at the entrance to a hospital. We were there hours after a drone strike, and we spoke to witnesses. We saw the aftermath. They killed 3 innocents who were walking out of the hospital in a drone strike. So the Israelis have gone completely berserk all over the region, frankly. And I think we need to understand what the ultimate objective here. They won't even stop in the West Bank, Rachel. You know, they will then try to destroy Lebanon if we allow them to succeed in their sinister objectives in Palestine. And they will attempt a full-blown war and bring the United States into a full-blown war with Iran. And the thing that we don't talk about enough is these people are capable of using nuclear weapons. We should have no illusions about that.
Yeah.
And so if we don't restrain them, we as in the international community, as soon as humanly possible, we may ultimately find ourselves in a world where the Israelis have employed nuclear weapons against their perceived adversaries in the region with catastrophic consequences for all of humanity.
Yeah, that is a great point, and something that I think that the US should be taking a little bit more seriously than it currently is. And I'm also curious too, when it comes to those cross-border tensions over the border in Lebanon with Hezbollah, we've seen so much back and forth there, right? We've seen Israel almost become the boy who cried wolf, because for months now they've been saying, oh, we're going to, decide on whether we're going to invade Lebanon and go to war with Hezbollah, or we're about to do it in a few weeks. And on Hezbollah's end, I mean, they have, as you were pointing out earlier, they're saying, look, these are our capabilities. We're showing you what we can do. We're showing you what you don't want to happen, because if we go to a full-scale war, this would be very embarrassing for you. And Israel just doesn't seem to care. How do you see those tensions there? I mean, obviously, on one hand, you have Hezbollah. They're becoming more united as a group. On the other hand, you have Israel with a lot of different fractures within Israeli society and a lot of frustrations going on there. Are you genuinely concerned about there being a full-scale war, especially that Israel initiates?
Well, I think the Israeli people should be more concerned than anybody, frankly, because this will be the ultimate catastrophe for Israel. I've been to South Lebanon 3 times since October 7th, most recently in the month of May. On my last visit, when we were on Beaufort Castle, from which we could see the Israeli military base of Metula, the resistance launched an attack on Metula. And there were repeated, you could see clearly that they were hitting the base with artillery shells. And then at a particular moment, after they'd struck it repeatedly with what appeared to be artillery shells, they struck it with a thermobaric weapon, which created a massive explosion. We saw this huge ball of flames come up. And then about several seconds later, the noise arrived where we were situated on Beaufort Castle, and it was a thunderous noise. And they're doing this regularly. They're regularly striking the bases every day, including up on Mount Meron, which is in the occupied Golan Heights, very sensitive military bases. They've struck them repeatedly. The Israelis have no answer for the drone warfare and the missiles, particularly the more advanced ones of Hezbollah. They've only used a tiny fraction of their capability. And one of the things that struck me, Rachel, when I was in South Lebanon, every time, even though, by the time I got there in May, they had suffered hundreds of casualties, the militants had, and there were dozens of civilian casualties. Many civilian buildings that I saw had been flattened. I haven't sensed at all one wavering in their determination. I think that they believe that this is the decisive battle and that it has to be won. It's either us or them. On the other side of the border, you have tens of thousands of people who've been evacuated. They're constantly being quoted in the Israeli press saying, we will not go back unless Hezbollah is pushed north of the Litani River, which is never going to happen, in my opinion. The Israeli government is having to fork over huge amounts of money to accommodate these families. And people are leaving the country, and the economy took a massive hit in the second half of last year. So I think the balance of resolve is on the resistance side. The Israelis are not as prepared for an existential war as the resistance. They're accustomed to this sort of thing. Israel's been subjecting them to horrors and oppression and brutality for decades, and I think they've had enough.
Yeah, I know that there is certainly a lot at stake here all around, and very telling when you have one side where they are fighting for their land, and then you have the other side where it seems like kind of a fun settler project until it turned into a war zone and it wasn't so fun anymore. Right. Exactly. We're seeing the results of that right now. I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Dimitri Lascaris, a Canadian journalist, activist, and lawyer, thank you so much for your time and insight.
It's a pleasure, Rachel. Look forward to the next conversation.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. If you want to support my work, you can also check out my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. That's where you can sign up as a monthly paid subscriber and join the community there. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.